I am Dr. Crystal Downing. I am the new co-director of the Marion E. Wade Center. And my fellow co-director is Dr. David Downing, and we're married to each other. So that worked out really well. And one of the many pleasures of working at the Wade is the opportunity to talk to scholars working on one of our various 7 authors. So I'm delighted tonight to be able to introduce you to Dr. Stephanie Derrick, an historian of religion who did her PhD at the University of Stirling in Scotland, and her dissertation resulted in this book, The Fame of C.S. Lewis, A Controversialist Reception in Britain and America. What makes this book interesting is that so many books on Lewis treat him uncritically, almost as this autonomous, brilliant scholar who rose from the sea, and don't consider some of the negative reception he got. And this is something that Dr. Derrick explores, as well as the historical context that affected the reception of Lewis's work in both America and Britain, and then comparing that, because of course, as we know, England and Britain are very different. So why is it that C.S. Lewis really became famous in America in a broad scale before Britain? One of the things I learned from Dr. Derrick's book is an element that contributed to the historical moment in which C.S. Lewis is writing is the development of the paperback in the 1950s. That hadn't occurred to me, how much that helped spread C.S. Lewis's work. Another fun fact I learned from her book is that Lewis is partially responsible for turning YouTube into an internet powerhouse. So if you want to know how, you'll have to buy her book. Speaking of which, many of you will notice that there are some flyers on the seats, and there are more flyers out in the foyer as well as at the desk. And we are providing you with a promotional code that gives you a discount to buy this book. It hasn't yet come out, so we don't have copies here at the Wade, but you can now get a discounted copy. As a transition into bringing Dr. Derrick to come speak to us, another fact that I enjoyed thinking about was that the year that Tolkien became a craze in the US, and of course that helped generate more interest in C.S. Lewis as well. But that year, 1965, was the same year that the Marion E. Wade Center was established at Wheaton. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephanie Derrick.
Thank you, Crystal. You're an astute reader, so you gave away all my book. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the Wade Center for putting this on. I know it's a lot of work to put an event like this on, and I really appreciate it. My first visit to the Wade Center was in 2007 when I first began working and researching on what became this book. That was the first of several trips to the Wade Center, and the staff has always been very generous with their time and very good at what they do, and I really appreciate their work and their support. So in this talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about, actually I left my thing. I left my thing. So I'm going to tell you a bit about why I wrote a book about Lewis, some of the surprising things I found while doing research on him, and a bit about why Lewis's fame is special. So that's going to break down basically as C.S. Lewis, circumstances, audience. So like probably most of you in this room, I grew up in a Christian family and have been part of the American Christian subculture all my life. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, attending a pretty intellectual Presbyterian church. All of our Sunday school teachers, it seemed, had taught at Reformed Theological Seminary, which is outside of Jackson. And one thing I noticed as a teenager was that C.S. Lewis was one of the church's leaders' favorite authors to quote, and everyone, it seemed, had read Mere Christianity. So I left Mississippi, that's a good thing, I think, to attend the University of South Carolina. And then a job for my husband took us up to Boston. Yeah, you can read into that one whatever you like. Where I studied the history of Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. During this time, I attended classes at Harvard Divinity School, and it was at a class at Harvard that the initial inspiration for my work on Lewis occurred. The professor of the class was originally from Belfast, which is also Lewis's hometown. And one afternoon, he made a comment that when he came to America, he noticed the intense fervor around C.S. Lewis. Whereas in Belfast, his and Lewis's mutual hometown, you could throw a conference on Lewis and hardly anybody would show up. And so this really struck me. Why are we so interested in Lewis? Why do we have a fascination with the man if people in his home country don't? And I spent the next 10 years working to answer that question. First, it was a term paper, then a semester-long independent study, then a PhD dissertation that took 4 years and included a 2-month stay at Lewis's former home outside of Oxford, and travel to archives, just so you appreciate it, in Bristol, Oxford, London, North Carolina, New York, DC, and of course back to the Wade Center several times. So it was a lot of work. Then more revisions, research, and rewrites went into the book that is coming out next week in America. It's already out in Britain, but yeah, so that's the background. But the point really is that though I liked him well enough, I didn't start this project because I was a C.S. Lewis fan, per se, but because I had this suspicion that if I could figure out what it was about us that attracted us to Lewis, that would tell me a lot about the kind of things I want to know about what makes American Christianity different from other forms of Christianity. Why do we think the way that we do? Why do we read what we do? And actually having those kinds of things as my driving questions was helpful for saying something interesting and new about Lewis himself, because most people, as Crystal mentioned, they've essentially written about Lewis because they admire him and wanted to get to know him better. And that book has its place, of course, but if most of the books written about a person are written by admirers, this will lead to blind spots in the literature. You need at least a few people who approach the topic from a different angle with different driving questions, because simply by asking different questions, you're going to notice different things. And this proved, I think, true with my own work. So, another advantage of asking different questions of a very well-known subject is that you're free to range widely. You don't have to rely on the same materials everyone else has, and actually the less you do, the better. In my case, of course I had to get to know Lewis and the work that was written about him, but the more fruitful ground was when I got past reading that to, and especially what other Americans had written. And the best stuff I found was hidden in indexes. Those sexy indexes that all haunt all of our dreams. I found 2 articles credited to Lewis that modern readers weren't aware of, This Way, which I wrote about in Christianity Today in last December. I also found that the picture that we'd been given of Lewis to date wasn't really complete. There were other parts of his story that hadn't been delved into. And again, by asking a different question, looking in new places, that opened up those parts of the historical record. So if there's students in the room, I have you in mind. Just because a topic seems, dare I say, overdone or fixed or unmovable, it may not be so. Looking where others haven't looked is risky business. Maybe they haven't looked there for good reason. But it's also a risk that with the occasional big reward. It also helps to live in a different country for a while, so give that some consideration. Okay, so what are some of the things I found researching Lewis that surprised me? Let's start off with one of my favorite finds. It's a portrait of Lewis I found while searching near and far for references to him by his peers. This one actually didn't go in the book. It's a historian at Christ Church, Oxford, and he wrote to his friend, "Do you know C.S. Lewis? In case you don't, let me offer a brief character sketch. Envision, if you can, a man who combines the face and figure of a hog-reeve or earth-stopper with the mind and thought of a desert father of the 5th century, preoccupied with meditations of inelegant theological obscenity, a powerful mind warped by erudite Philistinism, blackened by systematic bigotry, and directed by a positive detestation of such profane frivolities as art, literature, and of course, poetry. A purple-faced bachelor and misogynist, living alone in rooms of inconceivable hideousness, secretly consuming vast quantities of his favorite dish, beefsteak and kidney pudding, periodically trembling at the mere apprehension of a feminine footfall, and all the while distilling his morbid and illiberal thoughts into volumes of best-selling prurient religiosity and such reactionary nihilism as is indicated by the gleeful title, The Abolition of Man." Such is C.S. Lewis, whom Magdalen College have now put up to recapture their lost monopoly of the chair of poetry. So, what you'll notice right away is how flamboyant the language is. On a purely entertainment level, this is good stuff. And that's really the point, actually. This wasn't intended for publication. Hugh Trevor Roper, the author, is showing off for his friend. The subject just happened to be Lewis. And the letter suggests a lot about the atmosphere of college life at Oxford in Lewis's day. It was incredibly heady, very competitive culture, and over-the-top wit to our eyes was a way for these men to impress each other. And it was a small world, an insular world, and many people had detractors, including Lewis. It was a series of cliques, really. Lewis had his own clique with the Inklings, J.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, and Lewis's brother Warnie, among others. Yes, they were Christians, but they too played the game of college politics. For his part, Lewis actually had a reputation of being quite rough. T.S. Eliot, as some of you will know, was the subject of Lewis's ridicule and disparagement in his personal letters and published work. Lewis also published personally disparaging poems about both the poet Roy Campbell and the novelist Kingsley Amis, who was 24 years his junior. One student refused to be tutored by Lewis on account of his reputation for bullying. 2 other pupils of Lewis found that differences in taste and opinion on literary matters contributed to what became fraught relationships with their tutor. One of these was John Betjeman, who wrote that Lewis, quote, frequently told me I had no literary style during tutorials. Betjeman went on to become poet laureate in 1972 and one of the most popular poets of the 20th century. Another was the novelist Henry Green, whose dissatisfaction with Lewis as his tutor contributed to his leaving Oxford without a degree to join his family's firm in Birmingham. So, as I show in the book, Lewis took, but he also gave many punches in this insular, masculine atmosphere. This was one reason his peers didn't consider him simply the gentle, kind person American Christians often imagine him to be today. In fact, I found that Lewis wasn't short on detractors. Much of the criticism he received revolved around his tendency to be dismissive of those who disagreed with him on his pet issues, and also his adoption of a persona of a backwards-looking traditionalist with a hard-headed resistance to modernity. So I'll read a short excerpt from the book. Over and over, friends, colleagues, and reviewers wrote critically about what they saw as a kind of forced persona that Lewis adopted of someone stuck in a former age. Take, for example, students' memories of him. One student wrote, "It must be remembered that Lewis always affected, I think it was deliberate, to be a plain, honest man with no nonsense about him, usually wearing, when out on a walk, an old tweed hat and coat and accompanied with a pipe, a stick, and a dog." Another student remembered Lewis saying to him, "Rook, you think of me as a medievalist and a scholar. You're making a mistake. I'm nothing of the sort. I'm a butcher, a rough and brutal man." Another found it notable that Lewis habitually read the decidedly lowbrow Punch during the breakfast hour at Magdalen. Another student wrote that Lewis, quote, felt and even I suspect, took a pride in being old-fashioned. while yet another said that his dominating recollection of his tutor during the war years was of forced geniality, which he thought, quote, had become an inseparable part of Lewis's public persona, and which, quote, gave one an impression of a more toughly masculine and aggressive character than perhaps he was. Lewis's friend, Lord David Cecil, provided a description that resembled these former pupils' collective portrait. Lewis, he said, had adopted the mask of an extrovert, quote, lively, unintrospective, confident, combative personality, which he put on for his utterances in print or on platform. And a colleague at Cambridge likewise observed that, quote, there was perhaps something of the poseur about him when he first arrived at his new college. So going back to the talk, that was all from the book. Furthermore, many people saw a connection between this persona and what they identified as a reactionary quality in his writings. A fellow at St. Hilda's, for example, connected Lewis's, quote, resolute cheerfulness and equanimity, too resolute perhaps to be wholly convincing, with an effort to control his overwhelming emotions. This, she thought, at times expressed in his work as, quote, an underlying violence of feeling that led him to exaggeration and extravagance in the conduct of what is presented as a purely intellectual argument, unquote. While on other occasions it came through as, quote, an almost willful refusal to recognize what the work he is discussing is about, as distinct from metaphysical ideas or moral attitudes it inculcates. A.L. Rouse, a historian and fellow with Lewis at Magdalen, wrote that, quote, the rhetoric and the exaggeration Lewis got from his Welsh-Irish father became problematic when it carried over into the fields of literature, philosophy, or theology. Finally, in a piece called The Man Behind the Mask, C.S. Lewis, a Cambridge colleague wrote that Lewis's personal letters, published after his death, revealed a disparity between the private Lewis and the stylized version of himself that he presented in print. For one, he said, quote, extracts from his journal reveal that he had read very widely to the modern period, and that his mental equipment was by no means that of the old Western man he chose to present. So these criticisms were echoed in reviews of Lewis's books. One reviewer of Miracles wrote in The Spectator, Mr. Lewis has a regular technique. He presents a crude and contemptuous picture of what he dislikes, of naturalisms, which he identifies with a Cartesian mechanistic materialism, and of pantheism, identified with shallow sentimentality, knocks out his man of straw, then says, nevertheless, the poor thing is not so silly as it looks, and yet fails to readjust his own thinking so as to make allowance for its merits. The Narnia books didn't escape similar criticisms. The first editor of Puffin Books, Eleanor Graham, suggested that people familiar with Lewis's writings would be, quote, prepared for the powerful quality of the imagination, the good writing, and the allegory, such as were found in The Silver Chair, but that they would also have come to expect, quote, that strange lack of tenderness, which to my mind weakens the effect and the value of the work. Lewis's, quote, descriptions of human character and behavior, to Graham, revealed, quote, a great contempt for the human race. She closed her review with a quotation from St. Paul, which, she said, the reading of Lewis's book had brought to mind. Though I speak with the tongues of men and angels, though I understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and have not charity, I am nothing. So I explore this old Western man persona of Lewis's at more depth in the book. But really the point is that by not beginning with a presumption that Lewis was simply wonderful, I got a better understanding of how he conducted himself and was perceived in his own times. I should point out that there's plenty that's positive in the book about Lewis. It's the job of a historian not to take either the very positive or negative portraits at face value. You have to look at all the data and bring a critical eye to all of it. So for example, Lewis could be belligerent with students, but it's also true that he was a genuinely kind person. You can tell a lot, I think, about somebody by the way that they treat those with less status than they have, and Lewis scores high on that count. One historian of Magdalen College found that one lodge boy at the college, whose job it was to deliver mail around the premises, said that Lewis was the one fellow who always took time to talk to him on his rounds. When this man's father died and he himself fell ill for 18 months, Lewis helped him discreetly with funding that enabled him to further his education. Lewis's occasional driver, too, spoke warmly of Lewis, saying that they shared many meals together and he considered him a friend. We also know that Lewis took great pains to answer a steady stream of burdensome, time-stealing mail, when you or I would probably have been at least selective about who we wrote back. He could be grumpy as he churned out replies from Oxford. "Oh, the mails," he once complained. "Every bore in 2 continents seems to think I like getting letters." It probably didn't help that people came seemingly out of nowhere to ask him, for example, whether he wanted to join the Society for the Prevention of Progress or to ask favors. He wrote to Ruth Pitter, "Do you know what awful things Americans ask one to do? I have a letter from a lady in dear old Kentucky asking me to look into the London directory for the address of Fernando Marine, who lives at Harrow on the Hill and is described as a professor of mathematics. This is accompanied by butter, praise, and jam parcel, so I feel like I cannot neglect it, nor can I get to London." So after Lewis became very famous in the early 40s, absurdity came in regular doses delivered directly to his door. Still, he obliged. Why? Because he believed that he had a moral obligation to all individuals that has asked him for help. He said, "Every human being, still more every Christian, has an absolute claim on me for any service I can render them without neglecting other duties." Lewis believed that people, however apparently insignificant, were the most important thing one encountered in one's daily life. To an epistler who envied the bookish life he lived, he replied, "Never forget that souls are immortal, and your children and grandchildren will still be alive when my books have, like the galaxy and nature herself, passed away." So let's look at just a couple of more quotes, some of my favorites that I think are pretty spot on about Lewis. This is F.W. Bateson. He said, "What Lewis really is a shrewd pricker of contemporary intellectual bubbles, who likes to dress himself up partly for the fun of it and partly for polemical purposes as an Edwardian moralist. Bang goes the fist in simulated fury at some post-Edwardian excess, and at the same time a great grin opens on the jolly Irish face." And then this one is John Wayne, the poet who knew Lewis. He said, "Everyone who knew Lewis was aware of this strange dichotomy, the outer self, brisk, challenging, argumentative, full of an overwhelming physical energy and confidence, covered in inner self as tender and as well hidden as a crab's. One simply never got near him." Okay, so in the book, I say more about what I discovered about Lewis's personality and relationship to his peers that I think others hadn't gotten quite right, but moving on. Another thing I found by looking under rocks lying off the beaten track, was that while many of us think of Lewis as first and foremost a great Christian writer, his first love was really literature, not theology. In fact, contrary to popular belief, he didn't plan on writing defenses of Christianity. It was the Second World War and other Christians recruiting him into war work that made his career take a sharp turn. Through the 1930s, Lewis was occupied with tutoring, lecturing, and writing fiction and scholarly works about literature. But shortly after the war began, he was invited to preach at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, Oxford, at the invitation of the vicar, who had read his allegory, The Pilgrim's Regress. That sermon inspired a book editor to ask Lewis to write about the Christian perspective on pain, a timely topic during war. That book, The Problem of Pain, 1940, got the attention of the director of religious broadcasting for the BBC, Reverend James Welch. Welch wrote to Lewis in 1941, inviting him to address the nation using radio. Welch wrote, "I write to ask whether you would be willing to help us in our work of religious broadcasting. The microphone is a limiting and often irritating instrument, but the quality of thinking and the depth of conviction which I find in your book ought surely to be shared with a great many other people. And for any talk, we can be sure of a fairly intelligent audience of more than 1 million. So 6 months later, the first of 4 series of talks was aired on the BBC, the content of which was eventually published as Mere Christianity. At about the same time, he also published the Screwtape Letters. And after that point, Lewis was quite famous in Britain. He became known outside scholarly circles to regular people, and people began approaching him on all sides for more. So much so that he said to the BBC in 1941, "I'm talking already to the RAF, to the general public, to nuns, to undergraduates, to societies. The gramophone will wear out if I don't take care." Lewis did take care, but from this point forward, for the rest of his life, he was in high demand as a speaker. A couple of years after he wrote that to the BBC, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote to his son, "Lewis is as energetic and jolly as ever, but getting too much publicity for his or any of our taste." So I think there's been a lack of appreciation for just how large a part the war played in drawing Lewis into writing Christian nonfiction aimed at the general public. Lewis was commissioned by the BBC when the corporation was at the height of its influence, and during a time when everyone was turned into one radio frequency to hear critical updates on the war. Since the 1920s, when wireless technology first became widely available in Britain, the social elite had articulated a paternalistic vision for this new medium's educational and religious potential. During the war, the Ministry of Information expected the BBC to expound the connection between Christianity and the war. So, from 1939, religious broadcasting in a variety of forms was increased. And the British public was the recipient of a flood of preaching and teaching about Christianity. An audience whose daily lives were scheduled around radio news bulletins might, it was hoped, stay tuned in for a talk about Christianity. So I think it's pretty interesting that Lewis didn't set out to do what many people know him for today. Writing and talking about Christianity for the general public was something he was drawn into by other Christians and something he was doing in addition to his first job, which was being a scholar and tutor at Magdalen. As for retiring into private life, he once wrote, while feeling very strongly the evil of publicity, I don't see how one can. God is my witness, I don't look for engagements. Okay, so, but Lewis was far from alone from doing this war work. He kept being asked by other Christians to contribute his talents during the war because many of them were doing the same thing. He wasn't a lone voice speaking about Christianity. Other Christians, some of whom became more famous than Lewis, were preaching on a broad scale or writing for radio. Dorothy Sayers, one of the Wade authors, wrote a very popular radio play called The Man Born to be King. J.B. Phillips, who's in the bottom, was also very well known for his English translation to the New Testament and was a frequent broadcaster. Ronald Selby Wright was a pastor and the best known of all of them as a religious broadcaster. So reading again from the book now. Lewis's having been extended so many invitations to speak about Christianity was a reflection of the fact that there was in Britain at this time, among the educated classes, a widely shared sense that there was a need for moral direction. As Canon R.D. Richardson stated in 1940, national anxiety concerning the need for more thorough and systematic instruction in Christian belief and practice has been awakened under war conditions. The war created a shared sense of urgency about evangelism, a conviction on the part of many Christian intellectuals and clerics that the British people needed to be persuaded of the veracity of this established religion. War with Germany was widely understood as a confrontation between a Christian people with Christian principles on the one hand and a totalitarian evil on the other. Prominent members of state, including Lord Halifax, Anthony Eden, and Clement Attlee, described the war as being fought for Christian civilization. In a letter to the Times signed by the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, the moderator of the Free Church Federal Council and the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, it was asserted, quote, the present evils in the world are due to the failure of nations and peoples to carry out the laws of God. No permanent peace is possible in Europe unless the principles of the Christian religion are made the foundation of national policy and of all social life, unquote. For many in power, it was important that regular people saw a link between Christianity, woven into the culture and laws of Britain, and the righteousness of fighting the Third Reich. The lectures, sermons, and broadcast talks Lewis undertook during these years were his response to a shared sense of obligation to provide moral guidance to the country. So, the crisis passes, Britain begins to rebuild, life slowly returns to normal. After the war, Lewis wrote more books about Christianity, such as Miracles, his autobiography, a novel called Till We Have Faces, and in the early 1950s, The Chronicles of Narnia. He died November of 1963. He himself believed his books would pass out of favor after his death. Instead, particular historical circumstances intervened to keep them very much before the public. And I'm just going to highlight 3 developments in particular today, okay, in the rest of the talk. In the first place, Lewis's books were perfectly timed to take advantage of the advent of new mass media technologies. Radio, as we've seen, was key. Television and film were also new ways for Lewis's books, especially the Narnia books, to reach new audiences. Lewis himself apparently felt conflicted about the prospect of his characters being depicted in the new medium. He wrote to one person who wrote for permission to do a television rendition of the Narnia books. He said, quote, "I am absolutely opposed. Adamant isn't in it. To a TV version, anthropomorphic animals, when taken out of narrative into actual visibility, always turn into buffoonery or nightmare. At least with photography. Cartoons, if only Disney did not combine so much vulgarity with his genius, would be another matter. A human pantomime Aslan would be, to me, blasphemy." So, after Lewis is no longer around, he doesn't have a say in the matter anymore, and the first visual adaptation of the Narnia books appeared in 1967, when 9 20-minute episodes of live-action drama in black and white were broadcast on ITV. After that, the Episcopal Radio TV Foundation paid around $100,000 for the film rights to the Narnia books in 1975 and produced an animated film version that aired in 1976 and 79 in America.
I'm sorry, what year was that? Did that first happen?
Okay, so the 67 was the ITV, and then the Episcopal Radio TV Foundation got the film rights, and 1975, and 1976, let me just read it again. Okay, so they paid for the rights in 1975 and produced an animated film version that aired in 1976 and 1979 in America, and in Britain in 1980, winning an Emmy for Best Animated Film. The foundation then collaborated with the BBC on a dramatized version of the first 5 Narnia books for television, which aired between 1988 and 1990. These were all, of course, outdone by Walden Media and Walt Disney's movie version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was released in December 2005. That film broke box office records its opening weekend, as did sales of its DVD in 2006. Then, of course, there was Shadowlands, a British televised drama from 1985 about Lewis's marriage to American Joy Davidman Gresham, that Hollywood remade in 1993 into a movie starring Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. So Lewis's life and books were on the small and big screens at pretty regular intervals in the decades following his death. And in fact, a movie version of The Silver Chair, one of the Narnia books, is underway right now and is expected in 2019 at the earliest. Okay, so the second big development I want to mention is changes in publishing, which Crystal mentioned. Publishing grew exponentially in the 20th century with great benefit to Lewis. So take, for example, the paperback, a format we take for granted today. In 1954, Sir Alan Lane himself, the founder of Penguin Books and pioneer of the paperback format, approached Lewis's editor about publishing a Lewis title as a Penguin paperback. The first approach didn't result in an agreement, but in 1957, an editor of Penguin's children's book line, Puffin, tried again, writing to Lewis's editor, "I wonder if you would be willing to consider our printing, not before 1959, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis as a Puffin." The editor's response shows just how little even book people understood about how much the paperback would change publishing. He wrote to Lewis, this is Lewis's editor writing back, he says, "My experience over these paperbacks, and this is not confined to Penguins and Puffins, Lane's lot, is that they go to a public which does not read hardback books, or very little. I think there's some kind of subtle distinction between a magazine, which of course always has a paper cover, and a book. There seem to be thousands of people who go for the magazines and not hardboard books, and these are the ones who buy the paperbacks and, we hope, read them. Perhaps they may then slowly, via a public library, take to the hardboards as well. Proof of all this? When we publish books here in paperbacks, such as yours in Fontana, the sales of the hardboard editions are unaffected. In some cases, they are increased." So Puffin paperbacks of the Narnia books were produced and went on to become incredibly successful with both parents and the school sector, which meant a great expansion of the reach of the chronicles. Many of Lewis's books may be found in paperback form today because the 20th century saw an explosion in the reach of books to regular people. Lewis's books were swept up with those changes. This brings me to the third major social change I want to mention, and that's the expansion of education at all levels. As the population and economies of Great Britain and America grew in the post-war years, Lewis's books benefited from the founding of more schools, libraries, and universities. The Chronicles of Narnia were incorporated into the curriculums of primary education in both the UK and USA. Here is a small sampling, make sure I'm on track, of reading and teaching guides that recommend one or more of the Narnia books be read to children. Then, in America, at the university level, especially at places like Wheaton, many of Lewis's nonfiction and fiction titles became a resource for educators and students in hundreds of colleges, seminaries, and universities. And I'll say a bit more about that momentarily. All of these circumstances, television, film, the growth of publishing, and the expansion of education, created uniquely favorable conditions for Lewis to continue to be brought to the public's attention. His enduring fame, we could say, was tied to some of the great social changes of the 20th century. Because he wrote for popular audiences, wrote in many genres, and wrote so much, he benefited from these great democratizing changes more than many other authors writing at the same time. So part 3, audiences. So far, we've seen that Lewis was a complicated personality who was drawn into speaking to the British public at a moment of great crisis. And we've seen that a multitude of factors contributed to his books reaching mainstream audiences on both sides of the Atlantic in his lifetime and beyond. But in this last section, we need to take a look at audiences because they are the other side of the equation. And not all readers are the same. That's what made comparing Britain and America really interesting for me. Okay, so if you look from a high level at the trajectory of just the Chronicles of Narnia, then Lewis's reception in Britain and America looks similar. In both countries, these books were a surprise publication from an author primarily known as a scholar and writer of Christian titles for adults. And in both countries, the Narnia books became the books that Lewis was best known for. But if you look closer, you find that in Britain, there's always been a strain of negative and even hostile responses to Lewis and his books that really didn't exist in America to a comparable degree. On the other hand, there was, from the beginning, a level of intensity among Lewis's fans in America that rarely showed up in the UK. So in the UK, you have the novelist and critic David Holbrook devoting a whole book called The Skeleton in the Wardrobe to arguing that the Chronicles were the expression of a man with a deep psychological insecurity who created in his fantasies stern and even cruel authority as solutions to his self-hate. In America, on the other hand, you have Francis S. Collins, director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, saying this about reading Mere Christianity in medical school. Quote, "In the next few days, as I turn Mere Christianity's pages, struggling to absorb the breadth and depth of the intellectual arguments laid down by this legendary Oxford scholar, I realized that all my constructs against the plausibility of faith were those of a schoolboy." So obviously with an author as widely known and frequently written about as Lewis, I could also give you an example of an effusive positive response in Britain and one really negative response in the States. But having looked at thousands of responses to Lewis, these I can say are the better representation of the differences in Lewis's transatlantic receptions. So what is it about people in these two countries that made their reactions to Lewis different? That's not an easy question to answer. Some of the differences can be attributed to the fact that this defender of Christianity appeals to the more numerous Christians in America, where the faith has fared better than in the UK since mid-century. But it turns out that some of the reason circles back to Lewis's style of speaking in the guise of the sure-seated old Western man. The perception that Lewis was unwilling to engage with nuance and ambiguity continued to make him unattractive to some British readers. In 1970, the tellingly entitled Times Literary Supplement article, "Hard, Polemical, Black or White, Them or Us," wondered if Lewis had been content to live more in, quote, doubts and uncertainties and been less, quote, hot for certainties in this our life, unquote, whether he would have been a better writer, answering, "It is perhaps a futile question, for he would have been another man." The author concluded, "As a religious apologist, Lewis's striking and often brutal surface effectiveness means in the end that he does not quite speak to the condition of our time. And his clarity is that of the debater, and of the man scoring points against others. It is not a self-piercing clarity like that, for instance, of Pascal, Kierkegaard, or Newman. Or we have Kingsley Amis echoing the criticisms of Lewis's contemporaries. He said, Lewis was prone to an excessively bluff and breezy way with obstinate opponents or thorny points that can amount to loud-mouthed arrogance, reminding one uncomfortably that he was an Ulsterman, an Orangeman, suggesting now and then a miraculously learned and intelligent Ian Paisley. Importantly, such criticisms were also heard from British Christians. I'll read from my book again. In the second half of the 20th century, much of British Christianity, including evangelicalism, measured itself against the standard of honest, active engagement with the complex issues facing Christian theology, their neighbors, and the world at large. Fundamentalism, that strain of religion defined by belligerence, anti-intellectualism, a distaste for biblical criticism, and an aversion to social action, has been weak in the UK since the Second World War, while it has continued to thrive in America. In 1967, the National Evangelical Anglican Congress marked a resurgence of evangelicalism in Britain. However, evangelicals voiced their intention in that important convention and afterwards of participating in ecumenical ventures and becoming key players in addressing the social ills of the nation. Christianity in Britain after the Second World War was marked by its interest in engagement, a posture that repudiated the sectarian tendencies of previous generations and the fundamentalist strains within American Christianity. Resisting change put Lewis at cross purposes with some key ways in which the mainstream of British Christianity, and especially its leadership, was responding to the dramatic social and theological developments of the 20th century. In America, meanwhile, I argue that Lewis remained an influential figure for millions, in large part because the theological lens through which many Americans viewed their world endured, and because religiously tinctured perspectives came under increasing pressure over the course of the 20th century. In fact, in America, Lewis has been most valued precisely where people with theologically informed perspectives have engaged secularizing spaces. For example, Lewis was critically important for many Christian college students. From 1977 to 2007, for example, the percentage of evangelicals earning at least a college degree increased 133%, much more than any other religious tradition. One Christian publisher offered an explanation for why Lewis was especially useful for Christians experiencing college. He said, quotes and arguments from Lewis are used extensively and convincingly in both evangelistic dorm discussions and in a host of books for believers. Outside of the scriptures themselves, Lewis is probably the greatest authority and example of a thoughtful Christian faith. In a university environment, Lewis has the stellar academic credentials that command intellectual respect, while his journey from atheism to Christian faith describes a personal and spiritual authenticity that is attractive and not easily dismissed. As at mid-century, Lewis's Oxford credentials, as well as his tone of surety in matters of faith, was an asset, whereas in Britain, it was often perceived as a sign of disingenuousness, a hangover from the days of empire. So, I hope I've convinced you this evening that though he was a respected scholar and imaginative writer, there was nothing inevitable about C.S. Lewis's fame. It took the special circumstances of the Second World War to make him widely known, and it took a confluence of dramatic social changes to keep his name before the public in the decades after his death. And I'll conclude there. Thank you very much.